His firewood storage, a symbol of hard work, was being torn down by the HOA. Desperate, he uncovered an obscure clause in their bylaws that could change everything, a chance for justice. What happened next shocked everyone. But let's start from the beginning. James Carson had always taken pride in his backyard. It wasn't just a place to store firewood. It was a reflection of who he was. A man who relished the outdoors, who valued simplicity but with a touch of craftsmanship. He'd carefully constructed a storage unit behind his suburban home in Austin, Texas, using reclaimed wood that matched the natural aesthetic of his property. It wasn't extravagant, but it felt right in the space, blending seamlessly with the surrounding greenery and giving the yard a rustic, lived-in feel. James had spent weeks designing the firewood storage, making sure it was both functional and pleasing to the eye. He followed the Homeowners Association's HOA guidelines meticulously. He measured the dimensions, made sure the structure was unobtrusive, and even ensured that the wood was stacked neatly. In his mind, he'd done everything by the book, and he was proud of the finished product. But everything changed one cold October morning. James woke up to find a letter waiting for him. The envelope bore the distinct logo of the HOA, and something about the neat official lettering filled him with unease. He tore it open, and his eyes quickly scanned the contents. The HOA was demanding he tear down the firewood storage. They claimed it violated their aesthetic guidelines, but there was no real explanation. Not only did they demand its removal, but they were also imposing a fine that would increase if the structure wasn't dismantled within 30 days. James felt his heart drop. This wasn't just a minor issue. This was personal. He'd spent hours building something that made his yard feel like home, and now they were telling him it was a violation of their arbitrary rules. How could they deem something as simple as firewood storage a violation? He'd done everything right, or so he thought. The audacity of it stunned him. The HOA had always been picky, but this felt different. This wasn't about aesthetics. It was about control. The anger began to bubble up. The more James thought about it, the angrier he became. He couldn't shake the injustice of it all. The firewood storage wasn't just a haphazard pile of logs thrown together. It was a carefully crafted structure, built with his own hands, designed to fit perfectly into his yard. The wood had been selected with care, the design thought through down to the smallest detail. It wasn't just about storing firewood. It was about creating something that added to the aesthetic of his home. He had invested hours, even days, into making sure it was done right. And now they were telling him to tear it down. Every interaction with the HOA seemed to fuel his frustration. Each phone call felt like another slap in the face. Each email a reminder of how little they cared about his effort. They weren't willing to listen, and it was clear from their responses that they didn't care about the time or money he'd spent. To them, it was just another violation of their precious rules. They weren't backing down, no matter how much he tried to reason with them. It felt like a personal attack, as if they were trying to strip him of something he had worked hard for, something that gave him pride. James wasn't the type to back down easily, so he decided to dig deeper. He started going over the HOA's rules with a fine-toothed comb, desperate to find a loophole, something that might give him the upper hand. What he found only made his blood boil. The HOA wasn't concerned with fairness or the greater good. They were obsessed with appearances. Their rules were arbitrary, petty even, focusing on trivial complaints that served no real purpose other than to control people's property. As he researched further, he began hearing whispers from neighbors, rumors of past complaints, of unjust fines, of residents who had been forced to comply with absurd demands. The more he heard, the angrier he became. This wasn't just about a firewood storage. This was about a pattern, a history of the HOA overstepping its bounds, enforcing unreasonable rules, and treating homeowners like their property didn't really belong to them. James felt a deep sense of betrayal. Just when James felt like he was running out of options, something caught his eye. A small, obscure clause buried deep in the HOA's bylaws, tucked away in a rarely read addendum. He had combed through the documents multiple times before, but this one had somehow slipped under his radar. The clause was barely acknowledged in any of their communications, and it hadn't come up in any of his previous discussions with the HOA. But now, reading it for the first time, it felt like a light bulb had flickered on. The clause stated that, in cases where an HOA's decision led to financial loss or property damage, the HOA could be held liable for compensation. James stared at the words for a moment, allowing them to sink in. He couldn't believe he had missed this before. It wasn't a loophole per se, but it was certainly a weapon, one that could turn the entire situation around. The implications were clear. If he could prove that the HOA's decision had caused him financial damage or harm to his property, he might not only avoid the fine but could potentially demand compensation for the effort and resources he had invested. It was a long shot, but it was the first real opportunity he had to fight back. With a new sense of determination, James began to compile all the evidence he had meticulously gathered. He took more photos of the firewood storage, documenting every angle. He dug out records of the materials he had used, receipts for the custom-built structure, and everything else that proved he had followed the HOA's guidelines to the letter. Every email, every letter from the HOA. He kept it all. This wasn't just about fighting a petty rule anymore. It was about standing up for what was right and ensuring that his hard work wasn't in vain. James contacted a lawyer, who quickly confirmed what he had hoped. He had a strong case for compensation. The idea of flipping the script, of holding the HOA accountable for their actions, was exhilarating. It felt like the first real victory in a long, drawn-out battle. For the first time in weeks, James felt liberated, like the power had shifted back into his hands. The fight wasn't over, but it was about to get a lot more interesting. The legal battle was fierce, dragging on for weeks as James and the HOA clashed in court. Every time James thought he had the upper hand, the HOA found a new loophole or legal tactic to delay or dismiss the case. They threw everything they could at him: motions to dismiss, challenges to his evidence, and attempts to discredit his claims. The HOA's lawyers were sharp and relentless, but James refused to back down. He knew he had the law on his side, and his resolve only grew stronger with each legal maneuver they threw at him. In court, James remained composed, steadily presenting his evidence: photographs of the firewood storage, records of his expenses, and a clear timeline of how he had followed every guideline set by the HOA. He didn't let their tactics shake him. It became clear that the HOA's actions weren't just about enforcing rules, but about exerting control over its residents, punishing anyone who dared challenge their authority. For James, this fight was no longer just about the storage. It was about standing up to an oppressive system. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the case reached its conclusion. The judge's ruling was a powerful moment. James won. The HOA was ordered to compensate him for the removal and rebuilding of the storage. But the victory didn't stop there. The judge also mandated that the HOA publicly apologize for their actions. The words on the page were more than just legal jargon. They were a definitive statement that James's persistence had paid off, that he had forced the system to answer for its unfairness. The satisfaction James felt in that moment was incomparable. It wasn't just about the financial compensation, although that helped. It was about the sense of justice, the realization that he had taken a stand against an unjust authority and won. The HOA, which had tried to control every aspect of his life, had been exposed for its overreach and forced to own up to its mistakes. He didn't just win a legal case. He had reclaimed his dignity, and in doing so he had struck a blow against the very system that sought to oppress him.